Good morning, everyone. Today we will be looking at the subject of paying $5 million for the Samaritan 10 Commandments. And if anyone on this Zoom is the purchaser, please come forward. You can let me know privately if you don't want to publicly admit that it was you who paid for it. But this relates to an auction that took place back in late December at Sotheby's. Of an archaeological find, source number one, the oldest known stone tablet inscribed with the 10 Commandments, sells for over $5 million. The oldest known stone tablet inscribed with the 10 Commandments sold for more than $5 million at an auction on Wednesday, Sotheby's said. The 155-pound marble slab was acquired by an anonymous buyer who plans to donate it to an Israeli institution. That's very nice of you. The New York-based auction house said the final price exceeded the pre-sale estimate of $1 million to $2 million and followed more than 10 minutes of intense bidding during global competition. Right? That's everything seems to go for a lot more than anticipated. The tablet dates from 300 to 800 CE and is inscribed with the commandments in Paleo-Hebrew script, the only complete example of its kind from antiquity, according to Sotheby's. It was unearthed during railroad excavations along the southern coast of Israel in 1913 and was not recognized as historically significant at first. Sotheby's said the tablet was used as a paving stone at a local home until 1943, when it was sold to a scholar who grasped its significance. A tangible link to ancient beliefs that have profoundly shaped global religious and cultural traditions. It serves as a rare testament to history, the auction house said. The text inscribed on the slab follows the biblical verses familiar to Christian Jewish traditions, but omits the third commandment against taking the name of the Lord in vain. It includes a new directive to worship on Mount Gerizim, a holy site specific to the Samaritans, Sotheby's said. It's nice that Sotheby's are such experts on the 10 Commandments and the Samaritans. So this was what emerged. This is what was sold. If you look into the subject, if it sounds a little too good to be true, there's some dispute as to the historical authenticity. These are not the 10 Commandments of Charlton Heston fame from the 10 Commandments movie that are found at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles. But there is a back and forth. As is often the case here, it seems a little bit more a little stronger pushing back against the authenticity of these 10 Commandments. It's a little bit maybe too convenient that it's the third commandment that's replaced by the Mount Gerizim commandment. But in general, the coverage of this find in this auction, essentially everyone's in alignment. Obviously, they were sold for $5 million. It seems like a very historically significant find and artifact. It does have this Paleo-Hebrew script. It does have this replacing of the third commandment, not to take the Lord's name in vain, with the Samaritan directive of worshiping on Mount Gerizim. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about the Samaritans. Again, this week is Parshas Yisro. We will be reading the 10 Commandments. If anyone's third commandment is read any differently in Shul, please speak to your rabbi immediately. Something was probably wrong with the Torah scroll. But the Samaritans present a very interesting case study in terms of their status and their as Jews. As we'll see, there's a community still today. Let's talk about where that community comes from, how that community has been viewed historically and rabbinically in Jewish texts, and then a little bit in terms of how they're viewed today. As the idea of lost tribes or Jews disconnected from the Jewish community for centuries is one that emerges in all sorts of different ways. Some that are more Jewish, some that are less Jewish, some who want to be Jewish. So here we'll take a look at the Samaritans. They emerge as a subgroup within the Jewish nation back in Malachim Bet, source number 2, chapter 17. And this is the period after the destruction at the time of the destruction of the northern kingdom in Israel, right? The Assyrians come in and they exile the 10 tribes. The Assyrians end up giving way to the Babylonians, who destroy the first temple. And so here we are, the king of Assyria, source 2, brought people from Babylon, Kutach, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and he settled them in the towns of Samaria in place of the Israelites, right? The area you had at that time, the kingdom of Yehuda, Judean kingdom, and the kingdom of Shomron, the northern kingdom, right? The kingdom after the death of Shlomo HaMelech in the times of Rechavam, his son, split to the Judean kingdom and the northern kingdom, right? Yeravam ben Nevat, very famously at first, but that area is called Shomron. We reference the term Shomron in our Tisha B'Av Kinos. So now the king of Syria is putting in other nations in the area of Samaria. They took possession of Samaria and dwelt in the towns. When they first settled there, they did not worship God. So God sent lions against them that killed some of them. They said to the king of Assyria, the nations that you deported, the Jews, and resettled in the towns of Samaria, the nations that you deported, resettled to replace the Jews in Samaria, do not know the rules of the God of the land. Therefore, God has let lions loose against them and are killing them, for they do not know the rules of the God of the land. The king of Assyria gave an order, send there one of the priests whom you have deported, let him go and dwell there, let him teach them the practice of the God of the land. Right? These new residents are being killed because they're being punished by God because they're not following the commandments. So the Assyrian king says, okay, teach them the commandments. So one of the priests whom they had exiled from Samaria came and settled in Bethel. He taught them how to worship God. However, each nation continued to make its own gods, set them up in the cult places that had been made by the people of Samaria. Each nation set them up in the towns in which he lived. Right? We saw there were people from Bavel and Kutah and Ava and Hamas and Sepharvaim. Now they're learning some Judaism as taught by this Kohen, but they're still worshiping their own gods. They worship God, but they also appointed from their own rank priests of the shrines who officiated for them in the cult places. They worship God, capital G, while serving their own gods, small g, according to the practice of the nations from which they had been deported. To this day, they follow their former practices. So they're serving God, but also following their original practices. They do not worship God properly. It's not fully Jewish. They do not follow the laws and the practices, the teachings and instruction that God enjoined upon the descendants of Jacob, who was given the name Israel. So they're not fully Jews, but they were instructed as Jews. So they're worshiping God and they're also worshiping gods. But they did not obey, they continued their former practices. Those nations worship God, but they also serve their idols. To this day, their children and their children's children do as their ancestors did, right? That's the famous Ad Hayom Hazeh, which seems to indicate that these peoples have a continuing story. And so these are people living in Samaria, the Samaritans. One of the nations that's there are the Kutach, this is where we get the idea of the Kusim or the Kutim. And they continue to this day. So that is the biblical origins of the Samaritans, Shomronim, biblical origins of where we get the Kutim, the Kusim, Kutites from Kuta. This is also where we get the idea that emerges, as we'll see in a moment, just before we look at the Talmud text, but just as a precursor, this is where we get the idea that the expression that emerges of Gerei Arayot or Gerei Emet. Gerei converts, Arayot, not from with an ayin relating to prohibited sexual relationships, but Arayot from Ari with an aleph, lion. Are they converts because of the lions, right? The lions were killing them. So then it began the process of them becoming instructed into practice in the ways of Judaism. Or are they genuine converts because they accepted this upon themselves, and once they're Jewish, they start then veering away? That will be the source of it all. But just as a definition, you get this in Wikipedia source number 3. Samaritans are adherents of Samaritanism, an Abrahamic monotheistic and ethnic religion that developed alongside Judaism. According to this tradition, Samaritans are descendants from the Israelites who, unlike the 10 lost tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel, were not subject to the Assyrian captivity after the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed and annexed by the Neo-Assyrian Empire around 720 BCE, because that's where they were, right? They were the people who came in a sense, replaced the Jews and became the Jews. Regarding the Samaritan Pentateuch as unaltered Torah, the Samaritans view the Jews as close relatives, but claim that Judaism fundamentally alters the original Israelite religion. The most notable theological divide between Jewish and Samaritan doctrine concerns the world's holiest site, which the Jews believe is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which Samaritans believe is Mount Gerizim near modern Nablus in ancient Shechem. Both Jews and Samaritans assert that the binding of Isaac occurred at their respective holy sites, identifying them as Moriah. Right? This is not like Islam, who says it was Ishmael who was sacrificed. It was Yitzchak, and it was at Moriah. The question is, was Moriah Jerusalem or Moriah Mount Gerizim? Samaritans attribute their schism to with the Jews to Eli, who, as the high priest of Israel in the 11th century BCE, in accordance with Samaritan beliefs, he's accused of establishing a religious shrine in Shiloh in opposition to the establishment of the original shrine of Mount Gerizim. Right, this idea of the original shrine of Mount Gerizim would be the rationale for the Ten Commandments, including a command that everything has to be at Mount Gerizim. Right, kind of, if that is the honest to goodness, essential, authentic place for God's worship, maybe that makes sense to replace the "don't take the Lord's name in vain," because you have to take the Lord's name only in its original place. Just as up to a modern postscript, as of 2024, the Samaritan community numbers around 900 people, split between Israel and the West Bank. According to the Samaritan tradition, the position of the community's leading Samaritan high priest has continued without interruption over the course of the last 3,600 years, beginning with the Hebrew prophet Aharon. Since 2013, the 133rd Samaritan high priest has been Abayed El Ben Asher Ben Matzliach. In censuses, Israeli law classifies the Samaritans as a distinct religious community, but the chief rabbinate of Israel classifies them as ethnic Jews, Israelites. However, rabbinic literature rejected the Samaritans' halakhic Jewishness because they refused to renounce their belief of Mount Gerizim as the holy historical site of the Israelites. All Samaritans in both Chol and Kiryat Luz are Israel citizens. Those in Kiryat Luz are also of Palestinian citizenship. The largest community outside the Levant, the Shomrei HaTorah of Brazil, has approximately 3,000 members as of February 2020. Might be somewhere interesting to stop if you're ever in Brazil. See, what kind of davening they have on Shabbos morning. Maybe what kind of kiddush they have. Do they have cholent? Probably not. Or they let Karaites. We'll see that a little bit as we proceed with some of the way that rabbinic sources in Judaism has looked at these Samaritans. So that's the biblical origin. That's kind of through contemporary days. Let's go to how the rabbis understood them. Right? If they're there, at the end of the day, you meet someone who says they're Samaritan. Are they Jewish or not? So it's kind of on the one hand yes, on the one hand no, on the third hand both. Tosefta Trumot, and this is all usually related to whether or not someone who's a Samaritan or a Kusi or a Kutite, however you want to pronounce it. A Samaritan is like a Gentile, is what Rebbe says. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says a Samaritan is like an Israelite. Okay, which one is it? And so there's that machlokas again. It all originates with whether or not they became Jewish, and then once they become Jewish, they are Jewish, or was their becoming Jewish in the first place tainted? It has certain parallels with the practical discussion about conversion to Judaism. So for example, what happens if someone converts to Judaism, and years later you encounter them and they're not living a halachically Jewish life, but they said they converted in a halachic manner. So usually we would say that they're Jewish because if they convert in a halachically religious and rigorous manner or reliable manner, right? You look at their document that says 3 well-known rabbis who were known to do things the right way. And look, like all Jews, maybe they were very religiously observant when it started, and then they veered away from observance, and it doesn't matter, because once you're a Jew, you're always a Jew. However, what happens if the actual conversion process is compromised? Conversion processes can be compromised for all sorts of reasons. According to Jewish law, it needs to be witnessed by 3 observant males. If you're missing the Beit Din, there's no conversion. If a man wasn't circumcised, you're missing conversion. If there was no mikvah, you're missing conversion. If you're missing any acceptance of mitzvot, you're missing conversion. And we know that there's this idea when it comes to immersion in a mikvah, they call it tovel v'sheretz biyada. Someone who is trying to purify themselves by the waters of the mikvah, but then is holding on to something that's impure. So you go into the water to purify yourself, you come out of the mikvah, you're holding something impure, you haven't been able to purify yourself. So what happens if someone says, I accept Judaism, I accept the mitzvah, converts to Judaism, and the very first activity they have after the mikvah is to desecrate Shabbat, or is to eat non-kosher. So they accepted, but never actually lived. So there is a discussion in Jewish law that could be a comparable to immersing while holding something impure. And I guess for an expression would be the conversion didn't stick. The conversion didn't, because they they went through the mechanics of conversion, but never actually lived following the conversion. And so therefore, the conversion didn't stick. So in this case, with the Shomronim, the Samaritans, the Kutim, the Kusim, maybe their original conversion, maybe it stuck. And just the way they were living their lives, they didn't fully rise to the level of full observance, but they accepted Judaism and lived some Judaism, but not full Judaism, just like there are plenty of Jews who don't live full Judaism. Or was the initial conversion gerei arayos? Was it just out of fear of being punished by God? So they said, okay, we'll be Jewish like the Kohen teaches us, and they never lived Jewish lives. And so that's how you can get to a Samaritan as a Gentile, Samaritan as a Jew, and you have such a
remember about the papers?
Huh? Is there a question there? So that's where the rabbis had to go throughout trying to figure out what was the what is their status. So we see the Tosefta, which is kind of the basically rabbinic comments collected, let's say by the 2nd century. It's like analogous to the Mishnah. You see there's both opinions. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, they're not Jewish. Or Shimon Gamliel, they are Jewish. From a historical perspective, Josephus, and Josephus, of course, is that writing at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. So that's somewhat earlier than the Mishnah. But essentially parallel timeline in the Parsha. So Josephus writes, when the Samaritans saw the Jews under these sufferings, they no longer confessed that they were of their kindred, nor that the temple on Mount Gerizim belonged to the Almighty God. This was according to their nature, as we have already shown. And they now said that they were a colony of Medes and Persians, and indeed they were a colony of theirs. So they seem to be kind of fair weather friends. From the very beginning, right, Josephus is referencing the biblical story of the Samaritans that we saw in Kings 2. And is saying that as the Jews became oppressed, and in particular within the series of, he's referring at the time to the Hanukkah period of time, they're like, hey, us Jews, I know we're not Jews. And essentially Josephus is accepting the fact that they were at best fair weather Jews, and they were lacking in complete Jewish identity. And so from a historical perspective, you certainly have this there's a little bit of antipathy, and Josephus is siding with the side that they are Gentiles. You go further into rabbinic literature, as quoted in the Gemara. Again, so the Gemara is maintaining some of the views of the Tanaim, which is, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, that period. So, the early 1st centuries of the Common Era, post-Second Temple destruction. It was taught, Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Yossi, said, in this manner I showed the Sifrei Torah of Kutim to be false. So they're trying to talk about the Torahs of the Kutim. Like, right, we have, are they Jewish or are they not Jewish? So you have, yes, no, let's get into the practices of the Kutim. Are they living Jewish style lives? So here we have the Torah scrolls of the Kutim being analyzed, and they're false. And I said to them, you falsified your Torah and you have accomplished nothing thereby. For you say that the Elonei Moreh, the location of Elonei Moreh is Shechem. We also agree to say Elonei Moreh is Shechem, but whereas we learned this by means of a Gezerah Shava, how did you learn it? How do we know Elon Moreh is Shechem? Because the same terminology is used in describing that describes Shechem in one place is used in another place. So if in one place it describes Shechem, in the other place, even though it doesn't say Shechem, it means Shechem. So it seems that Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Yossi is pointing out that the Samaritans, the Kutim, the major flaw is that they're not accepting rabbinic Judaism. Right? That's not unlike other sects that we've seen, the Sadducees, the Byzantines, the Karaites, right? But this, Karaites really is something that emerges, later in the 9th, 10th century. Here we have in rabbinic Talmudic times that understanding that these Kutim are lacking in adherence to the rabbinic tradition. So the Yerushalmi in Sota has a version of this. So this is, one of the interesting things. We often talk about the Talmud Bavli versus Talmud Yerushalmi. Most of the time when you say Talmud or Gemara, we're talking about Babylonian Talmud because that seems to be more authoritative and has entered the religious, academic, Torah study consciousness. And just for those who aren't as familiar, right? We have the Gemara, often referred to as Talmud, has the discussions about the laws that are mentioned in the Mishnah. The Talmud Bavli is the collection of those discussions of the laws that was edited around the year 500 in Bavel in Babylonia. The Talmud Yerushalmi is this collection of those discussions that not exclusively that were taking place in Israel, but similar discussions, but it was edited in Israel. And the difference is that the Talmud Yerushalmi, pretty much the discussions that were collected in it ceased around the year 350 after the rise of Constantine and the diminution and the weakening of the rabbinic community in Israel under Roman authoritarian rule at that time. So around the year 350, we don't have any other, after the year 350, there's no other discussions in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Talmud Bavli continues rabbinic discussions and decisions for another 150 years. So since it's more comprehensive and has more of the rabbinic conversations, it's often viewed as more authoritative. People think that the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, is Aramaic, and the Talmud Yerushalmi is Hebrew. It's actually almost the reverse. Talmud Yerushalmi has more Aramaic because the Jews in Israel were very literate in Aramaic and less so in Hebrew. They were more educated in Bavel. In any event, it's interesting sometimes to compare similar conversations, and this is one in particular. We just saw the Talmud Bavli said, what's wrong with the Kutim? They didn't accept the Gezerah Shava. They didn't accept the rabbinic tradition about Shechem, and that's what's wrong with their Torah. Essentially, the Torahs are the same, but the Kutim are coming from a misplaced or a religiously inappropriate attitude towards the rabbinic understanding of the Torah. In the Yerushalmi, it's Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, not Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi. I told the scribes of the Kutim, you falsified your Torah and did not benefit yourselves at all, for you wrote in your Torah near Elonem Moresh Shechem. Is it not known that this is Shechem? No, you don't derive this by means of Gezerah Shava. We derived it by means of Gezerah Shava. Not only were they rejecting the rabbinic tradition, they wrote in the Torah Elonem Moresh Shechem. They specifically identified it in the written text without relying on the rabbinic tradition as to the location Elona and Moresh Shechem. So it's kind of, it wasn't just the rejection, wasn't just the rejection of rabbinic tradition. They actually, the Torah scroll is different, and they wrote things different inside of it. It's interesting that we talked about how the 10 Commandments are written in this Paleo Hebrew. The Samaritans continue to use that Paleo Hebrew script. That was the what they call the Ksav Ivri, the Hebrew script, which was then transferred to Ksav Ashori, the Assyrian script, which is our Hebrew script. It's interesting that what we call Hebrew is really Assyrian script. And of course, this leads if we're talking about the week of the Aseres Hadibros, the 10 Commandments, it's like, we think, when you have the model of them in the synagogue, it says Anochi Hashem, right? Written as in Hebrew, the words Anochi Hashem. That's not what it looked like on the 10 Commandments. In that respect, if you've ever seen the movie The 10 Commandments and it looks like these weird hieroglyphics, it probably was more like that than like the way it is by us, because it was written in that Ksav Ivri, that original language, and how it exactly looked and how the letters worked, if they were engraved all through, is a separate discussion. But here we have, in addition to whether they're Jewish or not Jewish, why would they not be Jewish, or why would they not be reliable? It seems it's possible there's a rejection of the rabbinic tradition, or there's literally a different Torah. They're writing things differently, and that disqualifies them from being viewed as Jewish. So, source number 8, Chulin 6a. What was the reason that they decreed the wine of the Kutim forbidden? Right, we say that idolatrous wine is forbidden. Why would the Kutim wine be forbidden? From Nachman Yitzchak said they discovered the Kutim had the likeness of a dove at the top of Har Gerizim that they were worshiping. They seemed to not only have a different space, but they were worshiping idols, right? This harkens back to what we saw in Malachim, that they worshiped God, capital G, but also worshiped God, small g. Rameir, following his own reason, said we're concerned for a minority, and he forbade the wine of Kutim on the account of the minority who worshiped the dove. No, it wasn't just, it's not true that the Kutim are all idolaters, but some were, and that was the concern. Rav Gamliel disqualified all Kutim from Shechita, also held like Rabbi Meir. So it was a situation where you had these Kutim who present themselves as maybe Jews. We consider their wine as if it's idolatrous wine. We consider their shchita, their slaughtering, also inappropriate, and either they're idolatrous writ large, or we're concerned after the minority. Okay, so in a ritual plane, we're not going to accept them. The Mishnah Nidarim, is their status Jew or Gentile? So this is one who takes a vow that deriving benefit from those who rest on Shabbos is forbidden to him. So let's say I can't get any benefit from anyone who rests on Shabbos. I can't, have a meal with them. I can't have them offer me a ride somewhere, right? You're prohibited from deriving benefit from a Jew because a Jew is someone who rests on Shabbos. Right? I'm not going to get benefit from a Jew. I'm going to get benefit from someone who rests on Shabbos. He's also prohibited from deriving benefit from Samaritans because they were also Shabbos observers. If I say I won't take benefit from, I forswear, I promise, neder, it's not a shvuah, I promise, I'm taking an oath that I'm not going to get benefit from a Shabbos observer. That applies to Kutim also because they observe the Shabbos. However, one takes a vow deriving benefit from those who are sent to Jerusalem is forbidden. I don't take benefit from Olei Yerushalayim, those who go to Jerusalem on the festivals. Well, that's only from a Jew, but not Samaritans, because Samaritans don't go to Jerusalem. So they're Jewish with some respect, they're not Jewish with other respect. The Rambam in the Perish Mishnayos in his commentary there, source 10, the Kutim despise Yerushalayim, and curse it is well known throughout the land. The reason for this is that which is displayed in the book of Ezra, Kal v'chomer, they don't perform Aliyah l'regel. So the Rambam is somewhat dismissive of the Kusim's Jewish claims in explaining this Mishnah. One other ritual area, what about if a Kusi, Samaritan, says a bracha? Do you answer amen or not? This is, in general, we take our amens very seriously. We answer that to appropriate blessings. You don't answer it to inappropriate blessings. So the Mishnah in Brachot, source 11, one answers amen after a Jew who recites a blessing, even if he did not hear the entire blessing. And one who's not answering amen after a Samaritan who recites a blessing until he hears the whole blessing in its entirety, as perhaps the Kuti, the Samaritan, introduced an element inconsistent with the Jewish faith. Right, so if I hear half of your bracha, I can say amen. If I hear half of Samaritan's bracha, I can't say amen because we're worried that maybe the Kuti is not talking about Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, God of the King of the universe. The Rambam in his commentary explains. He says everything in this Mishnah, me'inyan hakutim, relating to the Samaritans, right? They're somewhat more honorable than idolaters, but they're less than Jews. We talked about the idea that if it's three people sitting at a meal, maybe about counting the kusi and the zimun. But he says some of these things some of these laws, and when the rabbis are talking about relying on kutim, relying on Samaritans, that's before they really investigated whether or not they were appropriate. And they found that really, they're even worse than idolaters. Rambam saying Kusi, Samaritan, there's back and forth in the rabbinic discussions, but at the end of the day, we've really learned that their true colors, the Kusi, the Samaritan true colors are that they are not Jews and they are worse than idolaters. And the Rambam seems quite dismissive of Kusim. Rambam in general is quite dismissive of sectarians. Just as one other example before we look at some of the contemporary Samaritans, source number 13, what happens if a Samaritan man marries a Jewish woman or gives her a ring in the presence of witnesses? So he says, Kusi, this is Sefer HaItur in the 13th century, Kusi Shekidesh, a Samaritan who betroths, have the uvda v'etzruchu get neither of Yehuda Gaon or Mashmuel Reish Kala. There was a tradition. He's quoting a Gaonic Babylonian tradition that was more accepting that you have to do. You have to assume this was an act of Jewish marriage and it requires a get. Some say that we're extra careful when it comes to these things also, but they seem to be leaning in the direction that they have enough Jewish status to effectuate a Jewish marriage. And so, it could be the Rambam, and we know this from the Rambam in other places. The Rambam was very concerned with sectarianism in his time with that of the Karaites. It's understandable that he would be dismissive of other sects. Not clear whether or not the Rambam encountered Samaritans in his actual Samaritans, but the Rambam, very dismissive of the sect. And we recognize that the rabbis, for the most part, are split and they present enough evidence of that highlights that their status is at best disputed and sometimes rejected as being Jewish. Josephus historically has seemed to have written them out of the Jewish community. The Rambam says we've investigated even more so and have done so. But we see in certain other geographic locations, notably Babylonia with the Gaonim, they might be Jewish enough in this type of situation. Just, source 14 says the Shulchan Aruch seems to say we don't say amen to the bracha. And the Ramah seems to add, if you hear the whole bracha, you do answer amen. Maybe you have to understand or look at them at a case-by-case basis. Questions, comments before we move a little bit further into contemporary times as to whether they're considered Jewish or not.
Yeah. So I wonder if the sources, perhaps we can say that there's some consistency that the earlier source, the earlier source in Chulin that says, we don't put them all in one bucket, right? They're not all. We're worried about the minority. So on the first case where I forgot what it was, we're making a bracha, you have to hear the whole bracha, but at the same time, if they marry, if they go through kiddushin, perhaps they're in the half that in the portion that accepted Judaism and they were Jewish. So we're kind of trying to be safe on both ends. I wonder if we can say that there's some consistency there.
On the one hand, look, trust but verify. Maybe it depends on which of the halachas. Look, we saw in the Mishnah Nedarim, when it comes to taking a neder based on Shabbos, well, the Kusim are Jewish because they're commanded in Shabbos, whether or not they violate it. If you're taking a neder based on people going to Jerusalem for the holidays, the Kusim never went to Jerusalem for the holidays, so we're not going to include it. We seem to be looking at basically, of two minds. Just note, and this is not a comprehensive presentation of the sources, there are those that argue with the Itur. When it comes to practical law, if I'm not mistaken, we talk about you're allowed to charge interest to a Samaritan, but you're not supposed to pay interest to a Samaritan because he shouldn't violate you can treat him as if he's not Jewish, but he should not view himself as not Jewish enough for you to pay him interest. So there's this split verdict, that on it. I think that the Rambam, I think it very much like Josephus is saying they're not Jewish enough, and they're going to have to step into being Jewish to be viewed as Jewish, and it could be that saying a bracha and hearing in full is stepping into it enough. Look, we say you can make say amen on the blessing of a non-Jew if you hear the whole blessing. So a Samaritan is no worse than a non-Jew in that type of a situation. Rejecting their shechita or rejecting their wine, we're kind of categorizing in that respect. So it's kind of, that's what I mean by trust and verify. There is, the more we investigate, the more we find them not being fully Jewish, which means we lean, we accept the view that they're out unless they're acting in such a way that is not antithetical to any of the things that we do. So we're not going to drink their wine or eat the meat that they slaughter. But if I take a neder against getting benefit from Shomer Shabbos or those commanded in Shabbos, the neder is chal until I'm out to that neder type of a thing. It's kind of, we treat them as Jews when there are no consequences, and we don't treat them as Jews where there are no consequences. Now, Kiddushin is the exception, but like I said, the Itur is machmir and says that it's a marriage, but plenty are makil and say that it's not. I mean, I don't know if the issue has come up recently. As we saw, in the definition, for the most part, they're viewed as Israelis, but they're not viewed as Jews. They have their own, from a status perspective. But in terms of whether or not to consider them Jews, there's an interesting historical precedent, source number 15. And it is from the Israel's National Library blog. An interesting case which illustrates the multifaceted nature of Rabbi. He's talking about Chief Rabbi of Jerusalem during the Ottoman times, Rabbi Chaim Avraham Gagin. So approbation he gave to the Samaritan community. According to Islamic practice, only people of the book, generally understood to include Jews and Christians, have the right to protection under Islamic law. So Islamic religious scholars ruled that the Samaritans were not Jewish and were not afforded that protection, right? The Islamic poskim said they're not Jewish. Samaritan community of Nablus appealed to Rabbi Gagin to help them escape the dire fate of co-religious living in Damascus, who had nearly been wiped out due to Muslim persecution. Help us, save us. Rabbi Gagin sent a letter in which he wrote, the Samaritan people are an offshoot of the children of Israel who acknowledge the truth of the Torah. The Islamic authorities, recognizing Rabbi Gagin's personal signature and status, accepted the documents of the Samaritans, duly received the government's protection. So he accepts them as an offshoot of the Jews, not for any Jewishly religious significant reason, but to protect them. So their status as Jews to be viewed as an offshoot for protection. And that's why, if a practical, the question was asked, what about practical halacha today? Bottom line, Samaritans were and remain non-Jews, and that is the official approach of halachic Judaism today. Right? You want to call them Jews, you want to lean into them having some Jewish status, but bottom line, they're not Jewish. Samaritans, there's a separate religion. The Israeli chief rabbi requires Samaritans to undergo halachic conversion if they wish to be formally recognized as Jews. So just from a practical perspective point of view, they're not Jewish. Now, what about their practices today? And what kind of Torah, what kind of religion are they practicing? So there was an article in the Jewish Standard a couple of years ago. Remember, the Samaritans, they have our Torah. They have Har Grizim as being significant, but they have laws of Shabbos and laws of kosher and the like. It seems fairly straightforward that they never had much of an oral tradition. That's already something that the rabbis and the Talmud recognize. But so how are they living today? So source 18, Samaritans will circumcise on the 8th day no matter what. That's what it says. Bayom hashmini mo b'sar laso. We know that. We do bris on Shabbos. Because of the oral tradition, we don't do a bris on Shabbos when the baby's born cesarean section. But cesarean sections didn't exist in the times of the Torah. So the Samaritans have no exception. Bris on the 8th day. In contrast, long established halach post-wedding circumcision for a sick infant. The child's sick, you're not going to do it, but they don't have that exception. In the early years of the state of Israel, a premature baby was born to a Samaritan family, was placed in an incubator in a Tel Aviv hospital. So, al-pi Samaritan halacha, should this tiny baby be circumcised? They sent someone over the Jordanian border to ask the high priest what to do. The response was, what's an incubator? It's like, what's a bracha? What's a sports car? They explained it to him. He said, it's an artificial womb, so 8 days after the babies are taken out of the incubator, we'll circumcise. So just kind of interesting, how Samaritan Jewish law developed. And then there was the question of air conditioning. Like the Karaites, Jews who never bought into the Talmud's version of Judaism rejected the custom of lighting Shabbat candles. Samaritans say that if the Torah says no fire should be lit on Shabbat, it means there should be no fire. That means no electricity. This is opposed to rabbinic answer that balances the need for oneg Shabbat joy against the discomfort of Shabbat darkness. So what about an air conditioner? It's not an issue for those who live near Mount Gerizim because the mountain air is cool. For those living near sea level, though, that is an issue. There are 2 Samaritan synagogues in Cholon, one for those who use the air conditioner and one for those who don't use the air conditioner. So that solution sounds pretty Jewish to me. So we see that they too have had to cope with the modern era, but I don't know if a Samaritan was the one who bought that 10 Commandments for $5 million, but we see Samaritans have a very long history as being Jewishly adjacent, sometimes being viewed as more or less Jewish, practically speaking, viewed as being outside of Judaism. But as a Jewish adjacent religious community, sometimes dealing with very similar issues that Jews in the modern era face as well. So that is our discussion on the Samaritan.